Well, thank you very much. Never easy coming in here being the shark. And I can tell you I began to get very uneasy during Margaret's presentation. Thank you for the invitation, but on my biog, it's also going to describe a little bit about my guilty past. But I was one of those Bond people back in the 80s and the 90s, but in an Irish context, and sadly we weren't paid anything like that. We like to feel we were doing the country some service, trying to sell Irish bonds to global investors in challenging times, let's put it that way. And I'd like to say that in my own self-defense, when I got out of that business, what I did was I went off into Trinity and I did a blue paper, and I looked at our new regulatory system, which was then being set up, and I said that effectively it was a regulatory system that was designed to fail. And I mean, I'm not claiming any great 2020 vision on that, but it was, for a whole variety of reasons that became very, very clear, it was not an organisation that was really ever going to be able to work. So what I suppose want to say is fairly straightforward in an environment like this. I've got three basic points that I want to cover. First of all, business obviously needs financial regulation. No great surprises to anybody there. Secondly, I suppose I want to say there's some good news. I think what we're seeing right now is that regulation is really beginning to work in a banking context, But I think what I want to do, and this sort of links back into Eleanor's introduction, is that there's so much bigger and more fundamental challenges out there in terms of the way the shareholder model is working, and we've got some big questions to ask. So if Labour is a funny stakeholder, I think business is even funnier in the sense that there's a whole range of different interests. If you're running a small printing business down the road, employing 10 people, you've got a very different interest in all of this than if you're CRH or the Kerry Group. So in that sense, I think we've got to be very careful how we come at this. But business has some kind of fundamental requirements. I mean, you obviously need a financial system that works. One of the biggest problems right now, as we all know, is the availability of credit for small businesses. It's just not out there in the amounts that are required. And then on a bigger level, it's the ability to raise capital. As a country, we can't do that right now. So where does that leave a whole range of Irish businesses? Think of the challenges of our state agents, state companies like ESB and Bord Gáis at the moment trying to raise capital. These all sorts of knock-on ramifications. So regulation is clearly required. Now, I don't think anybody can be naive, especially not in a context such as this. I mean, anybody who thinks that business isn't an incredibly robust player in trying to design regulatory agenda could just be, naive would be the only word one could use. Dodd-Frank is a fascinating example to watch that going through Congress, passed July last year, and I mean the fighting has not stopped. And if there's a President Romney, we can tear it all up again and go back to first principles. So I think that's something that I think we have to take as given. And the Volcker rule, which is to stop global banks' proprietary trading. I mean if it wasn't for what happened in UBS a couple of weeks ago, the chances of that getting through, I think, were very slight. But I'm going to give you, I think, some better news because I think the game has changed, certainly in the Irish context. Okay, and I'll let Shane O'Neill describe it in more detail from the central bank's perspective in our next session. But we all know, and we all know way too much about what went wrong. I mean, anybody who's had the opportunity to read Simon Carswell's book, which I'd certainly recommend, about Anglo, it outlines it, and it outlines it in sad and tragic and very expensive detail for us all. How and the guilty partners or guilty suspects are all there. But I think there's a couple of other things to remember. That's in terms of banking failures. Some of the largest banking failures right now are the Landesbank in Germany. These were state-owned entities. They had crony boards, all right, but they were crony political appointees. And certainly the German and French financial systems are now having to come to terms with how to solve those particular issues. The cajas in Spain, they are another exocet in terms of the sort of European banking system in terms of their cost. Again, municipally owned. So very different incentives. We were talking earlier about Bill Clinton's policies in terms of promoting home ownership. One of the most extraordinary books that I've read about what went wrong recently was the book about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two state agencies there, which were privatized in a very egregious sense. And just our very latest news that we've had on the credit unions, sort of another surreptitious billion is having to be dropped into those. So there's a lot of interesting and sort of diverse players involved in all of this. So I think there's complexities, let's put it that way. Now, I think what's going on is that we are getting our act together, and I think if we look at how regulation is changing the model, I mean, we needn't get into all the technicalities, but I can assure you it's happening, and it's happening very much in real time. Again, just listening to Matthew Elderfield on the news at 1 o'clock, he's called in the chief executives of the covered institutions and talking to them about their behaviours in terms of their mortgage books and their variable rate charges. Now, call me naive, but I think there's been a very fundamental shift in the balance of power. Now, not at an enormous cost, but this is happening. This has been driven from Europe. Obviously, it's driven at a global level through Basel III. The European Banking Authority, this is a new agency, that's basically, if you like, is the ECB is there in charge of the sort of monetary policy. The European Banking Authority is a new, very much revamped and powerful agency now that's got overall responsibility for European banks at a European level. It's just issued about a 100-page document which is incredibly prescriptive on how banks must run their businesses now. So, there are things going on. We saw a couple of weeks ago the Vickers proposals in terms of the ring fencing of retail banks. So, the whole policy around deleveraging that's going on. So regulation, yes, it's working. Now, I think the bigger issue, and this is something that, as I say, Eleanor referred to, is this much more fundamental crisis. And this is not an Irish challenge, this is a much more global problem, and a very serious problem, is the challenge in terms of trying to make the shareholder model work. And, we all see what's been going on, that effectively institutional shareholders, the people who are looking after our long-term savings, do not see themselves as owners, but they see themselves as buyers or sellers of stocks or bonds or whatever. And if they don't like what's going on in a company, it's the old voice or exit, they exit. And what does that leave? That leaves a real issue in terms of incentivization of behaviors. And I think in a very challenging sense, we have to look back and see, we talked about egregious pay levels at senior in boardrooms, etc. Well, what are the behaviors that are being rewarded? In Anglo, it was pretty clear what the sort of metrics were that were being rewarded. What does BP do now after the Gulf of Mexico spill? What sort of metrics should BP as a global corporation be rewarding? How do you get things like safety into a measure? And it's interesting. BP worked in a very regulated environment, yet what happened. So these are the fundamental challenges, I think, that we're going to have to really be addressed. So what's to be done? I mean, in terms of banking, we've had the Walker Review, which looked at the whole standards of corporate governance and has come up with a lot of practical measures. Here we've had the fitness and probity tests. So I can assure you, anybody who wants to go on a bank board in Ireland right now, you're going to be checked over pretty thoroughly. If you're going to work in a senior position in any Irish financial institution now, you're also going to be gone through very thoroughly. We may say horses and bolted and all that, but at least that is happening. So corporate governance is basically run on this maxim of comply or explain. There is no statutory underpinning of corporate governance in these islands. I think in banking, that is no longer the case. And that's good news. I think there's something interesting going on, that we're going to have maybe two standards of corporate governance in Ireland going forward. We're going to have banking corporate governance at this level. We're going to have PLCs somewhere in the middle, where peer pressure, etc., is beginning to change things. And then we're going to have our state agencies somewhere down here, where it's extremely difficult to track what's actually going on. One of the solutions put forward is this concept of stewardship, okay, where a range of fund managers and financial advisors have signed up to this concept that they will engage under, and it's quite prescriptive again. This is the Financial Reporting Council in the UK. They're the people who, the Financial Reporting Council are the people who really are responsible for our standards of corporate governance in Ireland. We've outsourced that for a variety of reasons. And so they're trying to get over this principal agent challenge. Now, mixed results. I think it's kind of early days to try and say that there's any kind of clear solution. Who will hold them to account for their performance? Should it be pension fund trustees? Very few people are putting up their hand. But that I think remains a real problem. And I was glad to hear that Eleanor too talked about this whole idea of creating shared value, because I would push people to have a look at this. Michael Porter, who is a true guru of the strategy world, wrote this very influential, we wrote an earlier version of it a couple of years ago, but it is this idea of how do companies and societies create this sense of shared value. And he has a whole range of different examples in this article. I suppose one that kind of registers is the way that Vodafone in East Africa now have introduced, basically a low pay model, but that's allowed, literally millions of people to sign up to a banking structure that works, a mobile payment system, and that's obviously got really very positive repercussions. And there are obviously a lot, but his basic hypothesis is that businesses have to be a lot more ambitious in terms of the way they seek out these examples, and that if they want to ensure that they have a respected place at the table, these are the sort of actions that they're going to have to take. So, I mean, that there will always be a healthy tension between business and regulation. I think that is a sine qua non. But I think my basic and last and hopefully not too downbeat message is that there is a much longer term and more deeper seated problem that I think everybody is going to have to look to see how can be solved. So thank you very much.